Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum and how it is approaching a major crossroads. And I think it's going to pick a path within the next week. Okay? So if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Ethereum is really an interesting asset to look at within the cryptoverse. Its properties have obviously been, a lot different than Bitcoin, especially in terms of price action and how we see it move up on its Bitcoin pair during easing cycles and lower on its Bitcoin pair during tightening cycles. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, you can go look at the ETH Bitcoin chart and generally see that as the Fed reduces the size of their balance sheet, ETH Bitcoin goes down. As they increase the size of their balance sheet, ETH Bitcoin goes up, right? And so this is what we've seen, since basically 2022 is that the balance sheet has been dropping, and so too has ETH Bitcoin. And so one of the things that, keeps coming up is, well, when is ETH Bitcoin going to bottom? I do know that last cycle, and many of you guys are aware because I've mentioned it more than a few times, right? Last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed out when quantitative tightening ended. Now, Jerome Powell just came out yesterday and essentially said that they're not ending it right now. And oh, by the way, he also doesn't know when they're going to end it. Now, I don't really know if it has to play out like the same way as before. I have obviously gone on record many times, especially when ETH Bitcoin was back at 0.08, 0.085, saying that it could go as low as 0.03. And here we are. And it's kind of a struggle because on one hand, 0.03 seems pretty good value, especially considering it used to be at 0.08 back in 2022, and this is where I thought it was going to go. So on one hand, at 0.03, I'm like, what's the problem? Like, I mean, this is pretty good value if we can actually like look at the chart somewhat objectively and say, look, this always happens, right? You have a couple of highs and you break down and then eventually a bottom. So like, why should this time be any different? And I don't think it's going to be any different. The difficult part is that, this 0.03 number is where I thought it could bottom. On the other hand, quantitative tightening hasn't ended. So what am I to do? I mean, I do think a good investor readjusts their valuation of the market based on incoming data. So it might be foolish for me to just say, well, it has to bottom at 0.03. But, I think there's a chance that it happens. I think that the most difficult thing for Ethereum right now on its Bitcoin pair is just that quantitative tightening never actually ended. And so, even if it does get a rally, which honestly, I mean, with it sitting at 0.03, a lot of times when it hit other major levels, it got rallies. Like the first time over here, it hit 0.05, it got a pretty big rally. When it hit 0.04, I thought it got a rally, maybe not. I guess it didn't really get that much of a rally when it hit 0.04. Now it just seems like it's in this falling knife category, right? Where it just kind of keeps dropping and a lot of people are essentially losing hope. And I can sympathize with that. Now, if you waited until 0.03 to 0.04 to even get interested in this thing, then it's not that big of a deal, at least not until up until now. If it continues to drop, it could become problematic because I imagine it would drag the rest of the altcoin market down with it. Now, one of the things to remember is that sort of the more optimistic view is that ETH Bitcoin has bounced plenty of times, even during quantitative tightening, right? I mean, it had a lot of bounces throughout this whole period. And so that's sort of the optimistic view that even if it doesn't bottom, maybe it could get a bounce, right? Which is somewhat of a constellation prize. Another way to think about it is there's always a chance that it bottoms on the first low, and then the second low is when quantitative tightening ends. Like last cycle, the first bottom was when QT ended, and then the second bottom was just basically when they really started to turn the printers on. Maybe this cycle it'll play out in sort of the opposite fashion, where it the first bottom occurs before QT ends. But the reason I think it's at a crossroads right now is not because of its Bitcoin pair, right? The Bitcoin pair, as far as I'm concerned, it has still struggled, right? It still is struggling. It's been struggling for a long time. And it's one of the reasons why just sticking with Bitcoin has in fact been the better play. It has. If you're an ETH maxi, as much as it might be painful to admit it, that's the reality, right? And that's why we talked so much about ETH Bitcoin going to 0.03 back when it was at 0.08. But I don't actually think the crossroads that I'm referring to is on the Bitcoin pair, because I could see a scenario where the Bitcoin pair gets a nice bounce. In fact, if Bitcoin dominance plays out like it did over here, right, where it got, this initial high, kind of the same thing, right? Initial high, a higher low, or sorry, a low, and then you have a low, and then you have a lower high. Same thing, right? A lower high, a higher low, and then swept that high. So if Bitcoin dominance comes up here and sweeps that high, you can see that last cycle, it then got a pretty big drop after that. So I wouldn't be that surprised to see it sweep the high and then Bitcoin dominance to come back down here, and kind of continue to oscillate around this area. Even last year, we saw this similar thing play out where it moved up into December, but then it just kind of bounced around for a while and didn't really start moving up again until Q3, as the altcoin market just really started to bleed back to Bitcoin. So, if that is to play out, you might see Bitcoin dominance surge over 60%, only then get another drop where perhaps ETH Bitcoin could get a bounce. But here's the thing that I'm looking at, right? And this is the crossroads that I'm referring to. With ETH Bitcoin, I've been very deterministic about it going to the 0.03 to 0.04 range, and almost to some degree dangerously deterministic, because I could have been wrong, right? It always could have bottomed at 0.06 or 0.05. I could have been wrong. Maybe Bitcoin dominance never actually went to 60%, right? Fortunately, I was right about those things. Where I've also been deterministic is ETHUSD going to its lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? I've been very deterministic about it, and it never actually happened. And that's, just as this is more so maybe for me than for you guys, but this is just a reminder of the dangers of being deterministic about this sort of stuff. Is you can kind of see these things where you're deterministic about it, and then it just doesn't happen. And it never actually gives you that opportunity down in the lower regression band. Now, fortunately, it's been okay this cycle because it was easy enough just to be in Bitcoin as opposed to Ethereum. So you didn't really miss out on anything if you value your portfolio in Satoshis, which is what I think makes the most amount of sense to do, right? If you value your portfolio in sats, you haven't missed out on anything, right? If you've just been a Bitcoin heavy, along with the whole Bitcoin dominance mantra that we've been talking about for the better part of 3 years, then even as we sit here today, ETH is at a new cycle low. Now, on its USD pair, you might be like, well, Ben, this is not a new cycle low. If you think in terms of US dollars, you're correct. It's absolutely not. And I don't honestly expect it to take out this low this year, or maybe not ever, but I don't expect it to take out this year. And so one of the things to consider here is that if you truly value your portfolio in sats and not US dollars, then right now, ETH Bitcoin is at a cycle low, right? If you truly value it in sats. If you value it in US dollars, it's clearly not. Now, the reason why I think ETH is at a crossroads is because I could easily see this playing out in either way. And so I know that's not going to be very helpful, right? And I already know the comments, right? Oh, so you're saying it can go up or down. Feel free to go ahead and write that in the comment section. It will improve the algorithm. It'll help the algorithm out. But here's the thing, right? I don't really know what's going to happen right now. I have been very deterministic about it ultimately going to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, and I was wrong, right? I was wrong. I also think if you're going to try to mature as an investor, you have to admit when you're wrong and not hide behind it. And I think I've probably said a number of times over the last 18 months that I was wrong about this. With ETH Bitcoin at 0.03, it's hard not to at least find some value in it. I think that in the short term, ETH USD, there's a couple of different outcomes here that make the most amount of sense to me. Okay? So I'm going to go through those two outcomes, and they both end up being bullish, right? So it's sort of operating under the assumption, and it could be a false assumption, but I'm operating under the assumption that Ethereum does go to new all-time highs within the next 12 months, right? I'm operating under that assumption. Again, it could be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And, it just does what it did over here. but on a much grander scale, right? Where it like, does this and then finally goes up in next cycle. There's always a chance that happens, but if we want to be optimistic, right? If we want to be optimistic and we say, well, Ethereum goes to new all-time highs within the next 12 months, then what are the two most likely paths to get there? All right? So the more bullish path depends on Bitcoin. It absolutely depends on Bitcoin. And the reason I say that is if you look at Bitcoin USD, last year around this time, you can see that Bitcoin had also moved up and then consolidated for a couple of months, right? Same thing, moved up, consolidated for a couple of months. And then starting in February, it broke out again. Okay. Now, when Bitcoin broke out, right, when Bitcoin had that breakout, Ethereum essentially doubled up in price. You can see Ethereum, but in early February, ETH was at like 2,200, and then it went all the way up to 4,000. So it basically almost doubled in price when Bitcoin had that breakout in February and March, right? And so here we are. ETH is basically at 3,200. Right here again, it was 2,200. Now it's $1,000 higher. Same time of the year. Does it play out like last year, or does something different happen? If we first assume that the cycle goes on like normal, and what I mean by that is if you just go look at say the market cycle ROI from the low, right, from the cycle bottom, if you look at it like this, you could clearly say, all right, well, if the cycle just continues to track the 2016, 2017 cycle, right? If that happens, if Bitcoin continues to go up, it's unlikely that in the short term, ETH would go to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? I mean, Bitcoin has a way of lifting everything with it. It's the same reason that like all Bitcoin pairs are absolutely destroyed, right? If you look at like others Bitcoin, they've been doing nothing but putting in lower highs since 2021. But because they've been going up on their USD pairs, at least some of them, people feel okay. Now, they would have been better off with Bitcoin, but they won't ever care to look at a chart like this, right? Where the altcoin market has just been asymptotically dropping to these lower bounds for the last 3 years. So I think that if Bitcoin were to rally in February and March, just like it did last year, then it certainly would favor Ethereum to not drop to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? So a lot of it, I think, is going to be dependent on Bitcoin. Now, you might say, well, that's sort of a cop-out, but it's true, right? It's true. I mean, the only reason ETH has gone anywhere this cycle is because Bitcoin went up. Because Bitcoin has been dropping for basically 3 years straight. So the only reason ETH is even up right now is because Bitcoin is up. If Bitcoin weren't up at the same Bitcoin valuation, ETH would be a lot lower, right? So ETH going up in the short term to a new all-time high will simply depend on if Bitcoin can continue to go on to new all-time highs. Or at least for Ethereum, a new cycle high. It doesn't have to be an all-time high, but it could be a new cycle high. So ETH is very much dependent on Bitcoin. So again, it kind of raises the question, well, if it's dependent on Bitcoin, it would still make sense to be Bitcoin heavy as opposed to ETH heavy. Now, it's a struggle. ETH Bitcoin is at 0.03. It's relatively low. Counterpoint is if you look at ETH Bitcoin market cap division, so instead of price division, you look at market cap division, is it an oscillator? I know this was not a popular view when I talked about it back in 2022. Is it an oscillator? If it is an oscillator and not going to put in a higher low, then you could argue that it could still drop, from here before it reaches, that oscillator level. So that, I guess, is the counterpoint to the 0.03 target that I said, is that it's always a possibility that it gets that drop to that lower band down there. Now, counterpoint to that is that it did find some support in these ranges for a while before it actually made that move last cycle. So that's at least a consolation prize for those looking for comfort on that chart. So if Bitcoin, by the way, if you look at the running 1-year ROI, right, if you look at the running 1-year ROI of Bitcoin, the only way it's going to stay at a 2x is for it to go up in February and March, because last February and March, Bitcoin went up. And so we know it went to 73K. So the only way that Bitcoin's going to hold this 2x ROI is for Bitcoin to go up, right? It's got to push 120, 130, 140. If it doesn't do that, then it would start to do what it did in 2019, and that sort of fade below that 2x ROI. So if Bitcoin gets that rally, then the most likely outcome for ETH would be to bounce off of the bull market support band. And it could be somewhat similar to what happened over here. You might actually notice that ETH has gone to some of the same levels here, right? The first level was to tag 4K and then to drop to like 1800. That's the same thing that it did, right? It hit 4K and then it dropped down here to around 1900. And then it went back up to 4K, right? Back up to 4K and then back to the bull market support band, which is where it is right now. Now, if it follows 2021 and it gets a rally out of here, right, then that is the way that it could go to a new cycle high without having to go to its lower logarithmic regression trend line first. There does exist a scenario. We have to always consider all scenarios, right? There does exist a scenario that by the time it goes to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, the cycle's over, right? That's a chance. There's a chance that that's what happens, especially if it just continues to go up and gets lifted by Bitcoin. Because we know that ETH Bitcoin historically has not outperformed until QT ended. So if ETH is to go up on its USD pair, it's likely because Bitcoin lifted it up, right? Exactly what we've seen happen for the last several years. So I would look at it like this. I would look at it like we can see that ETH has been in a fairly consistent parallel channel, right? Where it goes to the lows occasionally, right? It's tagged it a number of times, and it's tagged the high a couple of times. It just got rejected from that sort of that center trend line, which is exactly where it got rejected at over here in April 2023. If it were to go back up to the top of this parallel channel in March, right, that would get you to around 6,000, right? Around 6,000, which essentially would be the same thing that it did last year. Instead of going from 2,000 to 4,000, it would be 3,000 to 6,000, okay? That is the optimistic scenario. And it's going to be dependent on Bitcoin lifting it up. I don't think that Ethereum can make this move on its own. Like if Bitcoin doesn't go up because we're still in quantitative tightening, I don't think that it can make that move on its own. So I think that's an important thing to remember, right? It has to have, Bitcoin has to participate. If Bitcoin participates, it could lift Ethereum up just like it did last year. That's the optimistic scenario. So scenario one would have Ethereum going to new all-time highs sooner rather than later. Scenario two, which still eventually would lead to a new all-time high by Ethereum, scenario two would be essentially a one final drop like this pattern over here, where it goes to the lower logarithmic regression trend line on sort of a third tap of it, like 1, 2, and 3, and you get sort of the same thing, 1, 2, and 3. And if it does that, then I would have to imagine, I could be wrong, but if ETH comes down here first, I have to imagine it would get a bigger bounce up, right? Something like that. And this is a pattern we actually saw with the S&P back in 1988 to 1990, or 1989 to 1990, where it had, where it basically put in a low, and then it had 2 lower lows after that, right? If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, just go look at it. It was right here. You essentially had sort of a triple top, and then that third lower low occurred into a recession, right? And it's not like it's impossible for something like that to happen. If you look at interest rates minus the 2-year yield, you'll see that even in 1988 to 1999, 1989 to 1990 is what I meant to say. If you look at that, you can kind of see that we got some similar stuff going on, right? A rejection off of this level up here, kind of comes back down, which is what it just did. So the only way, I think, at this point in the short term that you would see Ethereum coming back down here is if Bitcoin falls off course in the short term, right? If Bitcoin stays on course and follows its normal cycle ROI, then how does ETH get this move, right? You would have to see Bitcoin participate. So again, it kind of raises the question as an investor, well, if it requires Bitcoin to go up for ETH to go up, why not just stick with Bitcoin, right? I would argue that whole thing could change if ETH went down here, because if ETH went down here, I think it would force the Fed to go to QE, at which point I think ETH Bitcoin would go up. So it's kind of like, it's one of those things where, like, obviously if you hold a lot of ETH, you don't really want to see a drop. I mean, I own ETH, I do. I've said I do. Many times, especially after it went to 0.03 to 0.04. I think it's relatively attractive value at 0.03. So if you own ETH, it's not like you want to see it drop, But it's kind of one of those things where, like, if you want to see ETH Bitcoin durably go up, the only way it's going to happen is if ETH USD does drop, right? And leads to a pivot by the Fed. So it's like the only way to get to a point where ETH Bitcoin durably outperforms, at least in my mind, and I could be wrong, would be for it to drop here, allow the Fed to go away from quantitative tightening, and then get a rally. If instead the Fed just continues on with quantitative tightening because the labor market is just fine and real GDP is just fine, then you don't actually have to go down there, right? It could just go up. The problem, as I've said before, right, is that it would likely just be going up because of Bitcoin going up, and therefore, why not just hold Bitcoin instead? So that is really kind of where I am right now. Now, you're probably wondering, well, how the hell are we supposed to know what it's going to do? I think the decision is going to be made next week, right? So perhaps we'll do a follow-up on this video maybe a week and a half from now. Maybe a little bit sooner, but as soon as we have any data that can kind of confirm one way or another. If you look at ETHUSD, you can see that it's actually trying to hold its bull market support band, which is exactly what it did around last year this time. Counterpoint, of course, is that, there was a period right here where it was trying to hold it, and then it got a big drop. Now, the reason it got a big drop over there was because of the unemployment rate, right? The unemployment rate was skyrocketing, and so ETH was dropping during that time. Then ETH started going back up as the unemployment rate then consolidated. So next week, we're going to get the labor market results. If the labor market results are good, then, and I guess it depends on what's the definition of good, because you could have good news equals bad news or good news equals good news. But if the markets respond positively to the labor market next week, and I don't just mean ETH, I mean if risk assets in general, right? If the stock market, if Bitcoin responds positively to the labor market data next week, and we see another rally in February and March, just like we got last year, right? Just like we got last year, then I think the most likely outcome for ETH would be to hold support and to go up. If the labor market data is interpreted poorly by risk assets like Bitcoin in the stock market, then I think it'd be more likely to go down here, allow the Fed to print, and then go up. So both outcomes, in a very deterministic way of me, would eventually resolve with ETH going to a new all-time high within the next 12 months. It's just, how do you get there? Do you get there? Does ETH go to a new all-time high because Bitcoin is lifting it to a new all-time high and ETH Bitcoin is dropping? Or does ETH get to a new all-time high because QE is returned and ETH Bitcoin is durably going up? That's the tough call. And last cycle, ETH was taken to a new all-time high with a lot of money printing, and it was during a time when ETH Bitcoin was going up, right? ETH Bitcoin was generally trending up as ETH went to a new all-time high. This cycle, we've seen ETH USD go up, but ETH Bitcoin has gone down. So as an investor, you're like, well, you're saying it could go up or down. It's not, being a good investor is not about predicting where the market's going to go. I'll give you, it's not about predicting where the market's going to go. I'll give you a little secret. I don't know where the market's going to go. It's all about managing your risk, and it's about interpreting, where do you have things. I think it still makes sense to have, a sizable percentage in Bitcoin over ETH because of monetary policy and because the ETH Bitcoin valuation is a bleeding knife until proven otherwise. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have any ETH. I mean, 0.03 is probably going to be a relatively attractive value 12 months from now. But as an investor, if you have to pick one or the other, Bitcoin has still proven itself over Ethereum, right? And that's one of those things where whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not, believe me, I would prefer ETH to just bottom here against Bitcoin. I'll tell you why. Because 0.03 was what I thought the target low would be. And I know that if it goes below 0.03, then it's just one more thing I'll be wrong about, even though being directionally correct for 3 years was good. But if I don't time it exactly, I've experienced this market enough to know that people will be mad if it drops to 0.025. But look, here's the thing. If it drops to 0.025, then, or I don't know where it would be, but whatever the next support level is, right? Yeah, 0.025, 0.026. If it drops down there, because say the ETH Bitcoin market cap valuation has to drop down there, then, I have to imagine that ETH USD would have to get hit pretty hard at some point. A lot of times when ETH Bitcoin is down in the dumps over here, ETH USD does get a pretty large correction at some point. So as an investor, as an investor, Bitcoin still reigns supreme at this point in the cycle. It does. And look, guys, ETH Bitcoin could rally back up to 0.04 and it doesn't necessarily change anything, right? And I kind of hope it does. I'd like to get some people off my back, but I kind of hope it does. The problem is that this move here seems somewhat predicated on Bitcoin getting the same move, if not better move. So Bitcoin's probably a better play. If it fails to hold that as support, and instead of going up, it goes down, that is where QT would end. Money printing might begin. You connect the dots, and then you see ETH Bitcoin outperform and take ETH to a new all-time high. There's one other scenario that I could imagine. It's something that's kind of been in the back of my mind. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, right? There's always a chance that, you get Bitcoin to get a rally. It takes ETH to an all-time high. Then you get a drop. ETH goes home. Everyone thinks the cycle's over. And then you get another rally after that. That could also happen. I just think it's difficult because we've seen this pattern so many times with alt Bitcoin pairs. And we saw the same thing happen last year where they get this rally and then they drop and then they get another rally and then they drop. We had the same thing. It's just been more volatile, right? A rally and then drop, another rally and then drop. If it follows suit, then alt Bitcoin pairs should drop for a little bit longer and then potentially get another boost up maybe in a few weeks before eventually they just bleed once again. And so that is kind of the thing that you have to keep in mind, that if ETH is to get that move, right? Look at what ETH did last February on its Bitcoin pair, right? What did it actually do on its Bitcoin pair last February and March when it was going up? So if you go look at that, you can see that it had a couple of weeks where it actually got a big move up, but it all got faded. It all got faded away. So my guess is if Bitcoin moves higher and lifts the boats, Bitcoin will move first, and then a couple of weeks later, then ETH will move, and then ETH might get a rally back up to the bull market support band. If instead, all hell breaks loose in the macro for whatever unforeseen reason, and the markets just completely drop, then I think it would actually be a really good indication that ETH Bitcoin would be bottoming out sooner rather than later, and starting and getting that potential final drop on its USD pair to then go up. So again, two main scenarios, just to repeat myself one last time, and then I'm going to go, right? Two main scenarios. Scenario one, ETH holds support at the bull market support band and goes up. If it does that, it's only because Bitcoin went up, more than likely. So you could argue that just holding Bitcoin is a better play. If instead it goes down, then down here is where ETH would probably start to become a better play than Bitcoin. So it depends, do you want to go up with ETH Bitcoin struggling still, or does it go down and then up where ETH Bitcoin is outperforming? It's almost like you have to have some pain to get what you want, and what a lot of people want to see ETH Bitcoin go up. But how do you see ETH Bitcoin durably go up if you don't have a reason for the Fed to print? That's kind of where we are right now. That's where the market is right now. I think we're at a major crossroads. I think it's silly to be deterministic about either outcome. No one knows what the hell is going to happen, even though a lot of people pretend like they do. But those are my views on the market, and that's how I'm navigating this, right? Bitcoin heavy still, but if ETH drops here, I think that would be a good reason to really start to change that. If it doesn't drop, then you're still mostly better off in Bitcoin, though. With ETH Bitcoin at 0.03, I think it makes sense to have some ETH, right? Just in case it does get that rally up to, say, $6,000 or something. Anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on ITC Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.